Are mental disorders spiritual? Are mental disorders spiritual? So much mental health problems these days, it seems like, to me anyway, more than ever. People struggling with mental health, depression, anxiety, the like. Is this a spiritual problem or is it a medical, physical problem?
I'll let you take the spiritual. I'll just fill in kind of my views as to why I believe mental health is on the rise.
Yeah. First of all, when we're talking to people with mental disorders, to associate it with the spiritual is incredibly depressing and unhelpful. Let's first lay that out, because usually when they say spiritual, does that mean the only way you have a mental disorder is if you're demonically possessed? Now, to the credit, and I say this very reservedly, of people who make this diagnosis, the reason they say that is because, like epilepsy, which is a legitimate mental disorder, sometimes exhibits symptoms that also demonically possessed individuals have shown. Therefore, they say common symptom, common cause. Anyone who's taken Biology 101 and even knows how to spell germ knows that that's not how that works. If you have a common symptom, that doesn't necessarily mean common cause. It means that there's something going on. You need to get to the bottom of it. Now, when we're talking about examples of this, obviously, there are instances in the gospel accounts where Jesus interacts with a kid who went into fits and seizures and tries to kill himself just on a whim. And we see this as a suicidal tendency among people with mental disorders as well, but that can also be listed for other factors, which we'll get into in a moment. When it comes to the fine line, and I think this is the best place to put it for my own sense of reservedness, is if you want to know the difference between a demonically possessed individual and someone who has a mental disorder, deal with the demonic first, biblically, and if it doesn't work, then you've eliminated one of the two options. If the name of Jesus is about as meaningful logic that's employed in saying that, well, people who were demon-possessed in one or two situations had seizures, this person's having seizures, ergo, this person is demonically possessed. That's not only horrifically unhelpful to the individual, but it's unbiblical as well. I'm not sure which one is worse, but you can probably guess my opinion's the latter. As far as the biological factors, though, Peter, when it comes to the concern people have a lot with mental health these days, is it because there's an uptick in spiritual activity, or is it because of potentially other things that we're just either neglecting or pursuing?
Yeah, I'll just give you three. I could actually go on for quite a while on this, but there's when we say the topic of mental health, what we're referring to is we're referring to the idea that there is an ideal of mental health. There's a way that your mind ought to function. It's kind of like bodily health. Is anyone perfectly healthy on this planet? Well, no, but we do have an idea of, again, kind of like going back to our sex question, we know what each appendage is supposed to do, and therefore we know ideally what its function would look like. So therefore, it's very easy for us to determine when something has gone wrong, when there's an unhealthy portion of the body. Now, when it comes to the mind, there's a lot of difficulty in diagnosing what would be considered unhealthy. The reason why is because the mind, by definition, it's the intersection between the flesh and the spirit, right? The mind is something that we can't actually quantify or look at. We can look at the brain, but we know that consciousness doesn't derive directly from the brain. There's some other factor that's at play that neuroscientists can't really figure out. But we as Christians, we know what it is, right? We know that you have a spiritual component to you, that your consciousness is not just a conglomeration of neurons firing in your brain, that you actually have a consciousness, that it is real, that your sense of self and being are correct and they are created by God. But we also acknowledge that because the mind is the intersection point between the flesh and the spirit, we acknowledge that the brain has impact on the spirit. So while the way you think, right, Paul says in Romans 12 that we can renew our mind and therefore be transformed, we do believe that the way you think can have efficacy in the way that you behave and in even the way that your brain functions. There are crazy studies on that. But there are limitations to it because there is a such thing as an unhealthy brain. There are unhealthy thoughts and there's an unhealthy brain structure. and brain chemistry. Now, a lot of the brain chemistry is, again, it's not as a solid science as people try to make it out to be. It's very tentative. We don't actually understand fully what the chemistry of the brain ought to look like and how to meddle with it to get it at optimal levels. We've made attempts. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good, and we also don't know exactly how effective the mind is, meaning that how much would it affect someone just to think differently? Would it totally override these particular problems or difficulty? But let's just, and placebo effect is a huge study, and me and Sean talked about it, I think, a couple months ago, where they did a study on antidepressants, and they proved that placebos were just as effective as antidepressants in helping people with their depression issues. So it's not an exact science. Anyone who treats it as an exact science is lying to you. They're oversimplifying the problem. It's not an exact science. There are things that we can know, and there are things that we're guessing at. There are theories of how the mind works. And it is also important to understand that the people who created psychoanalysis, guys like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, they actually did not consider what they were doing to be a science. And by the way they defined it is they say a science is anything that is disprovable. What they said is because mental science is not actually disprovable, it can't be a science. It's something that can be studied. It's something that we can improve our understanding of, but it's not an exact science. It's not like medical science. It's not like mechanical science in that way. So a big problem, the reason why I give you all that kind of background, is one big problem with why mental health seems to be on the rise is because people seem to believe that a healthy mind will always function at optimal levels. Now, that's not accurate. Let's take the elbow, for instance. So, is it healthy for the elbow to be broken? Well, no. Is it healthy for an elbow to be broken if a car is dropped upon it? And the answer is yes. Your bone is not supposed to take that kind of pressure. If it does, I would actually have to either assume you're a superhero or something is wrong. There's something maladaptive about your bone structure for it not to break under that type of pressure.
This is good science, right?
Same with the mind. If somebody undergoes great amounts of stress or trauma and they're not affected by it, I wouldn't conclude that they're healthy. I would actually conclude you're unhealthy. There's something wrong with your mind that it's not being affected at all. Now, the ways that it could be affected are different depending on the individual, but some sort of an effect should show up unless there's something abnormal about the mind. The problem is a lot of people have diagnosed normal functions of the mind underneath abnormal stressors, right? So someone who undergoes great grief, let's say they lose a loved one, and they start experiencing depression, well, that's not unhealthy, actually. That's very healthy. You're supposed to grieve over loved ones. But I have spoken to at least one individual who was diagnosed with depression and given medication, antidepressants, after his sister committed suicide. Right? Now, that's bunk. That's terrible. You're not supposed to do that, right? He needs to grieve because that is a healthy function of the mind. So I think a lot of people today believe that any type of stressor, something wrong has occurred, and therefore they need some sort of a pill or therapy to get over it. And the answer is, well, maybe not. Maybe your mind is actually doing a very healthy thing, and you need to let it do what it needs to do. Just like if you break a bone, you need to allow your bone to mend. You need to allow these things to occur. Now, another big reason, I'll give you the second one, another big reason why mental health is on the decline, this is kind of a two-part one. Mental health is on the decline, especially in the West, is because the thing that people need more than anything to function is actually meaning and purpose. I would encourage people to read a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning, in which Viktor Frankl, being a Holocaust survivor, talks about that being the fundamental driving factor of a human being is our search for meaning, our purpose. Now, if you tell people, and this is going to get a little abstract, so try to stay with me here. Essentially, the way that you and I derive meaning and purpose is through obligations, things that we ought to do, things that we need to do. So there are many things in my life that I can do, but I don't derive purpose from them. I can go drive right now. I don't have to. I shouldn't. It's not like there's an ought. There's not a moral ought on me doing that. It's just something I can do. Therefore, none of my meaning or purpose is derived from that. However, I do have to work for a living, and therefore I'm going to derive purpose and meaning from that. I ought to be a good father to my daughter. I could derive meaning and purpose from that. And I also have divine obligations, means things that God wants me to do. All these things help me derive meaning and purpose. We live in a culture that believe that all injunctions on you are actually incarcerations, meaning that if someone tells you, you ought to do this, you have to do this, they have actually put some sort of an injunction on you and done something unfair and unrighteous. That the way to be happy is to be totally liberated from all obligations and worry. The problem is that you need obligations in order to have purpose. So if you free someone, quote unquote, from all obligations, you've also freed them from all of their purpose. So there are many people today that just don't have any meaning in life. They don't know what they ought to do. They thought that kind of giving themselves total and complete liberty would make them happy, but it's actually made them very unhappy. Take, for instance, the sexual revolution, the sexual liberation, as people have called it. Has it made our country happier sexually or unhappier sexually? The data's in. We know exactly how it's impacted people. Women are massively more unhappy than they were before the proliferation of the sexual revolution. Men are mildly less happy than they were, but they are still very much unhappy comparatively to what they were in the 50s, for instance. So when you free people up, quote unquote, from all obligations, you haven't done them a favor. Now, if you put people under false obligations, you also have done something damaging, but ironically, less damaging than freeing them up from all obligation altogether. So Viktor Frankl talks about this, that actually the Nazis producing bad obligations for the Jews, meaning making them work even to the point of physical exhaustion and death, although it was psychologically damaging, it was at least giving them some semblance of purpose. To take away all purpose from someone and just have them rot away in a cell, for instance, is actually to completely unravel someone's psyche, right? And people can't live like that for very often. So think about the reason why I said it's a two-parter. Where do we derive these obligations from? Relationships. You derive them from your relationship primarily with God, and then your relationship with your neighbor and your family members and people like that. That's where you derive these types of obligations. Because people are atomized, they don't have these relationships, and therefore their mental health isn't very good because they have no meaning and no purpose. Which leads into the third and final one. I'll try to wrap this up quickly.
Okay, you got 3 minutes, 2.5.
The main way that people actually are able to deal with psychological struggle. Now, this is setting aside extreme psychological disorders, which, by the way, even this is true for those things like borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, bipolar, which is actually called manic depressive now. No, I'm sorry, flip that. It's called bipolar now. It was called manic depressive, right? Even these more extreme mental disorders, the best way to work through them is through communication. This is, again, why Sigmund Freud and why Carl Jung were so revolutionary and why they did such a good job. The main thing they were able to do was just sit with people with massive psychological disorders and talk to them. Most people ignored them and treated them like they were lepers. They didn't talk to them. They just locked them up. They kept them in padded cells. Nobody tried to interact with them. What these guys did is they actually sat down with these people and they tried to understand them. Once they started making mental and psychological connections with these people, it helped them get back to a more normal state of being. Did they ever become totally normal? No, they had these disorders, but they actually were able to bring them to some semblance of normalcy through human interaction. The number one way to drive someone crazy is to totally isolate them, right? If you put somebody on an island by themselves, they will lose their mind. You need to bounce your consciousness off of other people in order to understand what is real. We're kind of like bats and sonar, right? That's what we need. When you atomize people and you subjugate them to only having major social interactions online, that's not enough of an interaction and a connection to bring about mental health. You need more than that. You need actual real life encounters that help you interact and figure yourself out. You need people that can press against you, people that you can't mute, people that you can't just cancel out of your social media presence, people that are going to be with you for the long haul. That is what produces mental health, and we're losing it at a great level in the West.